There are certain people in this world who, from a very young age, felt something they couldn't explain. A distance. Not a physical distance. Something far more painful than that. A gap between the way they saw the world and the way everyone around them saw it. They sat in the same rooms, heard the same conversations, but experienced something entirely different. As if everyone else was watching the same film in the same language, and only they were hearing a different version. One that was more complex, more layered, and far more silent. This isn't about arrogance. It isn't about feeling superior to the people around you. It's about a specific kind of isolation. One that doesn't come from looking different or acting different, but from the way your mind makes connections that most people never notice exist. And the question we're going to answer today isn't just who these people are, it's what actually happens to them. What happens when someone is too intelligent for their environment? Because the answer is darker, more complex, and more deeply human than most people expect. Before we go further, we need to establish what we're actually talking about. Because too intelligent is a phrase that gets misunderstood easily. Most people hear it and immediately picture someone with an IQ of 160 solving differential equations at age 8. And yes, people like that exist. But that's not the only form of intelligence that creates this particular kind of distance. In the 1920s, psychologist Lewis Terman launched one of the most ambitious longitudinal studies in the history of psychology. He tracked over 1,500 children with IQs above 135 across several decades. His hypothesis was straightforward. The most intelligent children would become the most successful, the most fulfilled, the happiest adults. The results were not that simple. Yes, many of them achieved professional success, but rates of depression, anxiety, divorce, and social isolation within this group were significantly higher than Terman had anticipated. The intelligence he believed would be their greatest advantage turned out, for many of them, to be their heaviest burden. Not because they lacked capability, but because the world around them didn't know how to relate to them. And that is the core of the problem. It isn't intelligence itself that becomes the issue. What becomes an issue is the gap between how they process the world and how their environment functions. Psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski described this through a concept he called overexcitabilities, a condition in which certain individuals feel, think, and process everything with an intensity that far exceeds the average. They don't just think faster, they feel deeper. They don't just have more questions. They are disturbed by questions that have no answers. And when someone like this grows up in an environment that provides no space for any of that, what follows isn't triumph. What follows is a long, quiet kind of suffering. Imagine you're 7 years old. You're sitting in class and your teacher is explaining something you already understood a week ago. You're not trying to show off. You're just bored. Not ordinary boredom. The kind of boredom that feels like something is slowly draining your energy, and there's nothing you can do about it. You try to engage. You raise your hand. You ask a question that seems completely reasonable to you. A question about why, not just how. And your teacher looks at you with an expression you'll remember years later. A look that sits somewhere between admiration and discomfort. A look that says, you weren't supposed to ask that. Research from the University of Michigan shows that cognitively advanced children who don't receive appropriate stimulation don't just experience academic restlessness, they develop behavioral patterns that persist well into adulthood. Some become paralyzing perfectionists because their internal standards can never be met by the external environment. Others do the opposite. They stop trying altogether. Psychologists call this underachievement, not because these individuals lack ability, but because they learned early on that effort isn't always rewarded by an environment that can't keep up with them. What's most painful is when these children try to connect with their peers and fail. Not because they don't want friends, but because their interests, the way they speak, the things that make them laugh or grieve, all of it exists at a different frequency. And when you keep trying to match someone else's frequency and it never works, eventually you stop trying. You learn to go quiet. You learn that your best thoughts are safer kept to yourself. There's a significant misconception we need to address. Many people assume that intelligent people are always aware of their intelligence and use it as a constant advantage. The reality is considerably more complicated. Most people are familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, the phenomenon where people with limited ability tend to overestimate their competence, while people with high ability tend to underestimate theirs. Not because they're artificially humble, but because the more you know, the more clearly you can see how much you don't know. Highly intelligent people often live under the assumption that everyone thinks the way they do, that everyone has the same questions, the same restlessness, the same need to understand things at their root. And when they discover that this isn't true, when they realize that the way they process the world isn't universal, the first reaction isn't superiority. The first reaction is confusion. And that confusion, left unaddressed, becomes something far more damaging. In 1978, psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes first documented what they called imposter syndrome, a condition in which highly competent individuals are unable to internalize their own achievements and live in constant fear of being exposed. What subsequent research revealed was striking. Imposter syndrome is most commonly found not among people of average ability, but among people whose abilities significantly exceed the average. They build their entire identity on the belief that they are not yet good enough. And because their internal standards are impossibly high, no external achievement can ever fill that space. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote something that cuts directly to the heart of what we're discussing. He argued that intelligence functions as a barrier between a person and simple happiness. Not because intelligent people don't deserve happiness, but because they cannot stop seeing the complexity behind things that everyone else accepts without question. People who don't overthink everything can enjoy light conversation without feeling like something is missing. They can accept a satisfying enough answer without needing to dig further. They can be surrounded by others and feel genuinely connected, without constantly filtering which conversations are meaningful and which are not. People whose minds work differently cannot do this. Not because they don't want to, but because their minds don't grant them permission to stop at the surface. Every conversation gets evaluated. Every claim gets internally cross-examined. Every relationship gets assessed for whether it runs deep enough to justify the energy invested. And that process never stops. This is what leads many highly intelligent individuals toward what researchers describe as existential depression. Not depression triggered by a specific loss or trauma, but depression that emerges from a constant wrestling match with enormous questions that have no answers. Questions about meaning, about mortality, about the systemic injustices they can see with uncomfortable clarity, but cannot fix alone. The Gifted Development Center in Colorado documented that children with exceptionally high intelligence frequently experience their first existential depression before the age of 10. Not because their lives are tragic, but because their minds are already wrestling with questions that most adults never genuinely confront. One of the most painful experiences of someone too intelligent for their environment is not career failure or academic failure. It's the difficulty of forming connections that feel real. Human connection is built on shared ground, shared experiences, shared values, shared ways of seeing the world. And when someone's way of seeing the world is fundamentally different from nearly everyone around them, building that connection becomes an exhausting, ongoing project. Research on friendship patterns among highly intelligent individuals produced consistent findings. These individuals have far fewer friendships than average, but the friendships they do maintain tend to be significantly deeper and more durable. Not because they can't make friends, but because their standard for what constitutes a real connection is far higher than most people require. The problem is the process of finding those connections. Before meeting one person who is truly on the same frequency, they have to navigate dozens, sometimes hundreds, of interactions that feel hollow. And every hollow interaction reinforces a narrative they began building in childhood. That they don't belong anywhere. That they are, at the most fundamental level, alone. This isn't paranoia, it's a documented pattern. And when someone lives within this pattern long enough, they begin constructing defenses. They become extraordinarily skilled at performing, not in a manipulative sense, but in a survival sense. They learn to mirror the frequency of the people around them well enough to function socially, while keeping the truest version of themselves stored somewhere very deep and very private. History is full of individuals who experienced exactly what we're describing, not as inspirational cliches, but as evidence that this pattern is real and has repeated across centuries. Nikola Tesla, whose name has become almost mythological, died alone and in poverty. Not because the world had no use for what he carried. The world desperately needed it. But because the way Tesla saw the world was too far ahead of his environment's capacity to follow. He wasn't destroyed by his intelligence. He was destroyed by the gap between his intelligence and the limitations of the world around him. Alan Turing, the man who literally helped end the Second World War by breaking the Enigma code and who laid the entire foundation for modern computing, was treated by his own country as a criminal. Not because he was dangerous, but because the way he existed in the world was different from the prevailing norms of his environment. And his environment could not accept that. Vincent van Gogh sold exactly one painting during his lifetime. One. Today, his works are among the most valuable in the history of human art. But during his life, the way he saw and represented the world was too different from what his environment could appreciate or recognize. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. And this pattern teaches us something essential: that a person's value is not determined by how well their environment can understand them, but the inability of the environment to understand them can, and frequently does, destroy them. So what happens to these people? Are they destined to suffer? Does high intelligence always end in isolation? No. But the answer is also not as simple as find your people or follow your passion, because the problem is more structural than that. What these individuals need, first and most fundamentally, is recognition. Not praise, not awards. Recognition that the way they see the world is valid, that their restlessness is not a sign of weakness, that their questions are not a disruption, that the depth they feel is not something to be ashamed of or hidden. Research from the National Association for Gifted Children consistently shows that the single variable most reliably separating highly intelligent individuals who flourish from those who don't is not their IQ. It's not the resources available to them. It's the presence of at least one adult in their lives who truly saw them. One person who didn't try to reshape them into a more convenient version of themselves, but who helped them find a way to exist in the world as they actually are. One person. That is often what separates someone who is destroyed by their own intelligence from someone who uses it to build something that lasts. There is one final thing that needs to be said, something that gets lost in every discussion about intelligence and isolation and suffering. These people don't want pity. They are not looking for sympathy. They are looking for something far simpler and far harder to find. They want to be understood. Not completely, because even they don't always understand themselves, but enough. Enough to speak without constantly having to simplify. Enough to be in the same room without feeling entirely alone. And perhaps that is the most human thing about all of this. Not the intelligence itself, not the unanswerable questions, not the gap between how they see the world and how the world sees them, but the simple desire, one that belongs to every single person, regardless of how complex or how straightforward their mind is, to not go through all of this alone. And maybe recognizing that is the first step towards seeing the people around us differently. Not with the assumption that we already know who they are, but with enough genuine curiosity to actually find out.